Sup people, welcome to 1000 Words. My name is Radu, I'm a street photographer from Romania, and today we're talking about this fellow right here. This is the Voigtländer 40mm, the Nokton 40mm f1.4 Classic SC. Quite a mouthful. And speaking of mouthfuls, today I'm having Beretta Brewing Company's MBT, a heavily hopped IPA containing Citra, Picherine, Riwaka, and Nelson Sauvin, or Sauvin as far as hops varieties go. 6.3 per volume alcohol content, quite misty, quite hazy, very pale, very fresh, quite a summery beer. And yes, I'm anticipating, although outside there's quite a bit of cloud, very rainy, gloomy and dark, there's summer in my glass. Before you get all up in arms about it, I know full well this is pronounced Voigtländer, but I'm not a psychopath. So I'll just call it the Voigtländer, or simpler yet, this shall henceforth be named the Nokton, a lens that was very kindly lent to me for an unspecified amount of time by my dear friend Paul, subscriber to the channel. So yeah, I was able to try it out for what seems like close to 2 months now, but the time I spent with it was enough for me to draw some conclusions, because this is a lens I wanted to get for myself for the longest time, and for good reason. Let's first up appreciate the diminutive size. Focus, focus, yes. Now, this lens is tiny. Sure, it's a rangefinder lens, and most rangefinder lenses are indeed smaller than their SLR counterparts, but this is on a whole nother level of small, with a very pleasant heft to it. The first time I held it in my hand, I was quite taken aback by how well it feels. It's machined out of really high quality materials, and while announced in September of 2004 and still in production, this is not a vintage lens by any stretch of the imagination. It's very much a contemporary lens, but other than the fact that it's somewhat recent and still in production, it's very much a vintage lens in soul, but we'll get to that. Hold that thought. It's a Leica M mount, which does make it, as I mentioned, a very small lens. But unlike other small lenses, this has a very incredible heft to it. It feels so dense, so surprisingly heavy. It's much heavier than it looks, weighing in at 175 grams. For this amount of lens, it's really surprising, quite surprising how dense and heavy it is despite its diminutive size. It has a diagonal field of view of 56.8 degrees on a full frame sensor, an optical construction of 7 elements in 6 groups, a manual diaphragm type with 10 perfectly straight aperture blades, a minimum focusing distance of 0.7 of a meter. Hold this thought because it will prove relevant soon. It features a focusing tab here, which is one of the main advantages of this kind of lens, of rangefinder lenses, with a 43mm screw type filter on the front and the bayonet type mounting for hoods. Hoods I did not use for this lens, and save for the one or two occasions when I was able to make this lens flare, I didn't really feel the need, or didn't feel like I suffered from a lack of a lens hood is what I meant. I do want to mention the fact that this lens comes in two variants. This here is the SC, the single coated variant, but there's also a multi-coated variant. I was happy because Paul had the SC variant, because this is what I was most interested in. Sure enough, the multi-coated variant is supposed to, and perhaps very predictably so, is supposed to have better contrast, punchier, more saturated colors, while the single-coated variant is supposed to provide a more classical rendering. Now, while I wasn't able to test the two, I only had the opportunity to test the single-coated one. I'm happy this is the single-coated variant, because if I were to buy it for myself, this is the variant I would go for. First of all, because while very much a contemporary lens, admittedly being inspired by vintage lenses with single coatings to provide a more classical rendering, this is still a modern lens with modern coatings, with modern formulas, modern glass inside, and save for a few key aspects I will get to soon, this lens almost disappoints if you're looking for character up the wazoo and vintage characteristics. Some aberrations have been intentionally left slightly undercorrected, especially with the single-coated variant, to provide a softer, wide-open rendering, some chromatic aberrations, some halation. But as soon as you close down a little, this lens becomes practically perfect. All issues mentioned earlier are resolved. This lens comes into its own, and the images it makes are indistinguishable from a modern autofocus lens. Now, as far as feel in hand, this was the first time I was able to try out a focusing tab. No, actually, I'm lying. I did use the, what was it? The Industar 50mm f3.5, the collapsible rangefinder Russian lens from 500 years ago, it seems. And yeah, but safe to say this was on a whole nother level. Ergonomically, the availability of a focusing tab and the very short focus throw, what is it, like, I think it's not even 90 degrees, and for a 40mm, that's impressive. So then, reiterating, the focus tab together with a really short focus throw means focusing manually this lens is an absolute breeze. It's extremely easy, it's really child's play. With the one caveat that it's kind of cumbersome to use when you're shooting in portrait mode, because once mounted to the camera, you have to do a bit of gymnastics like this to reach the focusing tab, and this lens also does not feature any sort of texturing or ribbing or knurls on the focusing rings, so there's really no other way to focus this lens except by using the focusing tab, which in most other circumstances is a joy to use. It feels great. The focusing mechanism, it's incredibly smooth, pretty much perfect. It's very well engineered. There's just the right amount of resistance, allowing for really precise focusing, and just the right amount of smoothness, allowing for easy operation. Together with that, the diaphragm really works great. The clicks are good enough, although it has some, see, it has these wings here, if you want to focus. These wings here, sure enough, while serviceable if we're talking about operation, they tend to grab on all sorts of things, especially on clothing. And you know me, I tend to shoot wide open most of the times. More often than not, I would put the camera to my eye and be surprised the lens is at f8 or f3 point something. It can be bumped out of place quite easily, and the clicks aren't really so, what do you call it, so sturdy, I guess, in order to resist being bumped out of place. But other than that, operating this lens is a joy. It's really great. Even the fact that the adapter is yay thin. It's kind of like, focus. It's basically really very thin. So it makes for a great compact package, light, small, excellent as far as ergonomics. Now, images. This is a bit of a two-sided sword, like they say. A double-edged sword is what I meant, because while on the one hand this is slightly undercorrected, on the other hand it's not undercorrected enough if vintage character is what you're after. If you want a bit of soul, you're basically forced to use it at f1.4 wide open. Practically anything other than wide open will provide you with really too good of an image. Sure, there are instances when you need a deeper depth of field, so you are going to close it down. That's when there's not much soul to be spoken of. However, I was stubborn enough to basically shoot it wide open all the time, like I do most lenses, and I was happy enough with it. Colors are pretty, lively, they're punchy. However, they have a moderate, reasonable kind of feel. They seem somewhat almost restrained and, I dare say, timid. It's not nuclear in your face like some Nikkor lenses tend to be. They're saturated enough in order to make a pretty image. However, it still manages to retain a classical, a restrained, soft, gentle look. Contrast is really quite good. However, this is basically where the advantages of this lens end. Hold this thought, because I will be making a comparison really soon. Now, on the subject of colors and contrast, this is an extremely good performer. Almost as good as most modern contemporary lenses, but with a bit of soul. It's somewhat soft, wide open, and I like the fact that it is. There is some halation, there is some chromatic aberrations, there is a very slight amount of geometric distortions in the way of barrel distortions, but that is something that is extremely easily fixable in post, so that's basically a non-issue. Easy to focus, so easy to achieve good, sharp photos. As far as black and white work goes, this is where I think this lens shines, and you will kindly forgive the pun. It is my bread and butter, it is what I mostly do, but I think it tends to give images a shine, almost like a metallic shine that not a lot of lenses do, especially when we're talking about skin tones and highlights. They look like they're glowing, and this is not really just halation alone. It's something to do with the way this lens renders images. It's really flattering, really great as far as portraits go, because shoot it wide open, the fact that it's slightly soft, coupled with the fact that it tends to make highlights glow, this is absolutely wonderful for portraits. It makes for charming images. f1.4 means really great subject separation, pretty blur, albeit sometimes slightly nervous, but I do like me some character in the blur. I'm not one to enjoy that amorphous mass of color and form that completely melts away in nothingness. I do enjoy somewhat distinct edges in my bokeh. I do enjoy a bit of swirl, but not Helios 44 levels of blur. That's kind of like a bit too much, if you ask me. That's really very situational, and it's not always pretty. But back to this lens, the blur this lens makes is pretty enough. with a bit of soul, some character, some jittery, some nervousness in there, but not enough to look distracting. However, the one flaw I would, if we are going to call it a flaw, the one thing I would hold against this lens is that it's not vintage enough. And again, we have to keep things in proportion. This is not a vintage lens, and nor should we then expect it to behave like one. However, I think it does the job well enough. It's vintage enough while not being vintage, and it's good enough for the times when you need a good lens. Some flare is observable in some situations. I did intentionally shoot this really against the sun, and it does make some colorful arches, which are not the prettiest ones, I'll give you that. Also not the ugliest ones. So it's neither here nor there if we're talking about lens flares. I did, however, notice the fact that despite the fact that the front element is so up front, I guess, it doesn't really beg for a lens hood. I used it without a lens hood for the entire time I had this lens, and it was only once or twice that I was able to make this lens flare. Disappointingly enough, because I like crazy wild flares. And on the subject of crazy wild flares, this is a good segue to this. Why am I showing you this? Because it's a 40mm lens. It's not much bigger. Actually, I think it's the same length. It is. It's actually the same length, somewhat fatter, considerably lighter, and 5 to 6 to 7, almost 8 times as cheap. And if you compare the images these lenses make, you will find that the Konica, because this is what I'm talking about, the Konica Hexanon 40mm f1.8, twice reviewed on the channel. Once or twice I even claimed this is my desert island lens. I think it might very well still be. There are still some lenses in my collection I haven't used yet, but I will momentarily reserve this title for this lens. My desert island lens is sometimes even 8 times cheaper than this is, while being sharper at all apertures. Not as well corrected, not as contrasty, but I mean, you can't argue with 8 times cheaper. I mean, Jesus, get 3 of them and you're still left with money. While this is good, close to great in most regards, I don't think it's worth the $500, $400 to $500 this lens is found at on eBay. However, this lens is worth $60 or $70 or $80, and if you're paying more than $80 for this lens, you're being scammed. A pristine condition Hexanon 40mm f1.8 is not more than $80. Never is, never should be. In conclusion, close to great, this lens, if considered in vacuum, is practically unbeatable. 40mm f1.4, excellent, feeling the hand, really flawless. This is where this pales in comparison. The Konica is not nearly as well built as this is. This has quite a lot more plastic than I would like to, while this has none. It's just metal and glass. It has the most satisfying density I've ever felt in a lens. It just feels like it's fantastic, fantastic workmanship, really great engineering, makes you fall in love with it. In vacuum, because once you begin to compare this with this petty, let's call it, Konica 40mm f1.8, that's oftentimes $50 to $60, it just kind of doesn't make sense anymore. Because the difference in light gathering ability between f1.4 and f1.8 is really not that much to merit 6, 7, 8 times the price. Nor is the build quality, because while this is in a whole nother class, this is not a badly built lens. It's still mostly metal with the exception of the aperturing. It's and the beauty ring. Yeah, there's a lot of plastic in here. It's a late 70s to early 80s Konica lens, so it has more plastic than I would like it to have. However, if we're talking about this, the images this lens make are, if you judge it by sharpness, better than this does. And also, let's not even get into the fact that this lens focuses down to 45 centimeters, while this only does 70 centimeters. And this is the single biggest drawback of this lens, bar none. I've shot this around the house a lot, taking photos of my wife and baby daughter, like I like to. And very often it was the case that I wish this focused somewhat closer. Now, I understand this is a rangefinder lens. Rangefinder lenses have their limitations, but I think we're comparing apples to apples here. This apple is basically better than this one, except for a few key areas. I don't know. I think it's down to your own choice. Personally, before having tried this, I was enamored with the idea of owning this. Now that I have tried this, and thank you, Paul, for the opportunity, I no longer want it. And I do understand I'm very repetitive. I'm basically like a broken record here, but I'm a sucker for well-built gadgets. And this is some of the best built I have ever been witness to, I guess. This is not much far behind. And really, when you think that this is 7 to 8 times cheaper, I mean, this is where the argument ends. It depends what kind of person you are. Some people will prefer this because it's a bit more contrasty. Colors are a bit punchier, somewhat more vivid. The build is really much better. However, this is sharper. It focuses closer, quite considerably closer than this one does. And it's basically the price of a few packs of peanuts. Really large packs of peanuts, but you get my point. I think I've bored you enough. Very briefly before I end this, quick lens check. What's on my camera? What's next in my review list is this. The Nippon Kogaku I have to read this. The Nippon Kogaku Nikkor S Auto 50mm f1.4. You can never have enough 50mm, can you? I've just started using this lens a couple of days ago, and it's a big honking monster. Bit heavier than this, but I think it's great. Stick around. Watch this space, because a review for the Nikkor S Pre-AI, this is a Pre-AI lens, 50mm f1.4 is incoming. That said, I have been Radu. This has been a review for the Voigtländer 40mm f1.4 Nokton Classic S Voigtländer. There you go. Yeah. Thank you for watching. Farewell.